Hello and welcome to the School Governance webinar series for 2019. Today's topic is on the importance of the chairperson for your school board. My name is Michael Iannini. I'm a CIS consultant and the managing director for PD Academia. I'm joined by my partner in crime, Paul Smith of the Futures Directors Institute. Please note that this webinar series is something that we've been doing now for well over a year, and there are several other webinars and newscasts that speak to the topics that are critical to boards for effective governance. You can find them at our LinkedIn group, the School Governance Network, or YouTube. You can additionally find resources from pdacademia.com, where we have links to the presentations from these webinars, as well as additional comments. That said, Paul, let's get into our topic today. Something that's of incredible import when we think about our chair, that I'd have to say is it's not so much about their ability to run effective meetings or to get things done. I would say the chair is in many ways the parent of the school that needs to really take into account all of the feelings and the emotions and the hopes and the dreams of everybody represented in that community. And hopefully that the governors are also able to be mindful of. Because sometimes in a boardroom, either the chair just wants to get through an issue, or perhaps even the governors want themselves to rush through it. But, you know, is everybody taking into account what's at stake here in terms of the students? So, you know, I love this slide because it really speaks to about that heart and soul. And, you know, that gets to the idea of EQ. Paul, with that said, why don't you take us through where we're going with this webinar today, and let's get right into it.
Thanks, Michael, and hello, everybody. One thing to point out about this slide, whilst Klaus is a wonderful guy saying wonderful words, not all chairs have to be old and white, and I think that's important to point out as well. Just thinking about our webinar today and what we're going to go through, we're going to be talking about how key office bearers are appointed, in particular, obviously, the chair. We'll be taking you through the role and responsibilities of the chair and the qualities that make an effective chairperson. But also we'll be thinking about what mistakes you can avoid when appointing the chair, or again, if you are thinking about nominating yourself for the chair or becoming the chair, what things to look out. My experience, why we're doing this webinar, interestingly, is through a lot of the work I've been doing recently with boards around who have been struggling with the appointment of the chair. They've either made a mistake and appointed the wrong person, or they're really not sure about who to appoint. They're either bringing someone in from outside, or they're appointing one of their own, and they've really been struggling with who is the best person to lead this organization and be the parent and be the heart and soul of the board, rather than the entire organization. Obviously, that's the role of the CEO and management or the head of school in that respect. So that's why we're doing this together. It was a really interesting topic, and Michael and I brought it together and put this webinar together for you. So moving on quickly, key things to consider when appointing a chair, though, regardless of whether you're on the board or shareholders or whoever happens to be your members. The chair is that most important appointment in the boardroom. As we talked about, they are the leader of the board, and that's really, really important thing to remember. And therefore, it's also, whilst it's really important when appointing any governor to your school, it's really, really important to start with your vision, mission, and values. That's at an organizational level, but also at the board level. Why are we here? What's our role? Who are we trying to be? How will we behave? And therefore, we need the chair to really reflect that. And so it's important to start with what I would call like first principles in that respect. Your vision, mission, values, purpose, whatever it happens to be for you. So moving on, these are some of the key ways in which the chair is appointed. Now, the chair is an office bearer or office holder of the board. So if you're starting with everybody as a governor, the chair, like the treasurer or a secretary, depending on what's relevant for you, not all those positions are held at board level. The chair is an appointed office bearer within the board. That's the first thing to remember. Basically, how they are appointed should be governed by your articles of association, bylaws, or constitution, depending on what they're called in the country where it happened or how you're governed as a school. But if they're not written down or you haven't constructed this sort of stuff yet, these are some of the ways in which chairs are appointed. The first way is a nomination committee, which is a subsector of the board, vets candidates and recommends the best choice to be ratified by the board. Another one may be an open vote by the board, and we'll get into potentially what happens if that extends beyond the board. It could be that you've already got a deputy chair and they're held up to be a successor, or you're selecting a chair directly from outside the board, and you might actually use a committee in that way as well. There's lots of advantages and disadvantages to each of these processes. Some are quite outdated. For example, the successor, the vice chair as the successor, is generally outdated. The role of a deputy chair is usually to pick up when the chair is unavailable rather than to be a successor. You know, basically, as you can see there, the open vote is a good one, but obviously you can have a lot of backroom dealing and politics going on. There's lots of different ways in which the chair can be appointed, and all of these are used not just with schools but with companies and organizations as well. Our recommendation is the same recommendation we'd have for our 9-step process for recruiting your board. It's no different. We'd actually recommend a nominations committee is put together as a subset of the board, but also you can bring in, as we've talked about before, you can bring in third-party expertise, recruitment, whatever it happens to be, marketing if you're putting the role externally. And the nominations committee, essentially, they work on the process of appointing the chair. And that can be, if you're appointing the chair from an internal group of candidates, it could be seeking nominations from the internal. If you are seeking external appointment of someone to the chair directly, they'd be running that process as well. And that would be our recommended process, is to use a subset of the board to run the process. And then it really depends on what your structure is, what's in your articles of association.
Yeah, I'd almost even say too, when I look at this, Paul, we need to also consider that the chair is running through all 9 of those steps, right? I mean, right down through to the training and evaluation. So it's important to note that we need people other than the chair to hold the chair accountable to this process as well.
That's right. And again, you know, it's very easy for people to look to the chair to sort of hold this process together. But again, when you're appointing a chair, then it's up to the board, or at least a subset of that board, to run that process. That's right. Now, I believe, did you have a question at this point, Michael? Because I'm thinking about, like, again, there are other things to consider in terms of who does the election. I've mentioned, you know, that the board may be electing the chair, but when, you know, a lot of schools, as you'll know, Michael, have the election of governors is done at the AGM. And that can impact the chair selection process because, you know, and what usually happens is the chair is the appointment of the board, but the governors may be the appointment, or at least the ratification of the voting for by the members of the school. So when it comes to the chair, is the chair being elected by the members of the school as well? Normally, no, but you may have a decision which is ratified by the members of the AGM as well. But usually, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so I was going to say, like, what we were talking about even before the webinar was, you know, this is it chicken and egg? Because at what point does the nominations committee really step into action here? Because we want to make sure that we've nominated governors that are going to qualify for our requirements to be a board chair. We want to make sure, just like the nominations committee, ensuring that we have a good pool of candidates to serve as governors. We also effectively need a good pool of candidates to serve as chair, because it's unfortunate when people step into that chair role just because no one else wants to, because of what's demanded of them. So, again, chicken and egg, how do you address that?
Well, basically, that's the thing. Usually, what you'll have in the AGM, you'll have a chair appointed at the AGM, and that person who is the chair may or may not be up for re-election as a governor, but it tends to be best practice that they are already the chair in place because they've been elected by the board to hold that position. Now, if your articles of association give the power to the members to vote who is in the chair position, then yes, the nominations committee will be doing a lot of work up front regarding that appointment as well as the appointment of new governors. But again, it's essentially no different than appointing governors and being put forward in front of members. So like with our recruitment process, the process kicks in very, very early if you're appointing a chair in time for an AGM. But usually the chair is running the AGM, so they are, in terms of their role as chair, their appointment as the office bearer is not up for grabs at the AGM, but their role as a governor may be as well. So it can be quite complicated, quite confusing, but usually those two things aren't collapsed. But again, as it says on the slide there, it really comes down to what's written down in the rules that govern. Again, as I said, we talked about the Articles of Association as well. The other point I want to make here as well is about non-exec versus exec. You have obviously some organisations where the founder is on the board. You have in the corporate world, you have it where the chair is also an executive. And what I mean by that is they have an operational management role. So there might be CEO and executive chair. The school equivalent of that will be the head of school is also the chair of the board. And I don't think any of us have ever seen that happen. Plus, it'd be really hard to get accreditation if that was the case. However, you could have a head of school that runs the board. But the chair always tends to be non-executive because there wouldn't be any other executive person beyond the head of school that probably would be qualified to be the leader of the board. So essentially what we mean by non-executive is it's a non-management, non-operational role. And that will be the case for most school boards, let alone most organizations as well.
Yeah, so I mean, when we think about the self-perpetuating boards in particular, with the founder, and some of these boards, that do have nominations committee, it's finding that balance of self-perpetuating and the chair continues to fill that role, but you have a nominations committee that is if they're going to enact those 9 steps of the selection process that we identified here previously, the recommendation method, how do we keep that all on track?
If it's a self-perpetuating board?
Yes.
Yeah, and again, it will come down to what's written down. If you have a self-perpetuating board, as you said, you may have term limits to the role of the chair, and you're appointing somebody else in the board to take over. You mentioned like a founder-led school, you might have the founder as the chair in perpetuity until they retire. And really, if there's no rules written down around term limits or how you could remove that person, then really you don't really have any power or say. So again, it comes down to the documentation, the rules governing the organisation. What you might find in a self-perpetuating board that's not founder-led so much is you have term limits, and that's a really good practice to ensure a refreshed view, refreshed leadership, whereby the chair role can only be held for like 1 or 2 terms of 3-4 years or something like that. So you might have a maximum term of 8 years as chair in these sort of self-perpetuating boards. And again, it comes down to what's in your articles of association. And also, going back to a point I wanted to make around, the process and nomination committee, if the chair is to be voted on, like it would be potentially by the board, the nominations committee puts forward their candidate and it's then ratified by the board or ratified by the members. You may also get a situation where there's a choice of 2 or 3 and it becomes a popular vote. That's rare. It's usually a case of ratification because the board is a delegated authority, whether it's delegated from the owners, the founders, or the members. they're delegated to be responsible for this sort of thing. So usually it's a ratification process. But again, you're double checking what's written down in your arts association. If it's not mentioned, then that's essentially, this is something you can then start writing in, and you want to follow best practice.
Yeah.
So moving on now.
Right.
Yep. Moving on now to the role of the chair itself. So that was really about the how they're appointed and that sort of stuff. But I really want to talk now about the role and responsibilities of the chair. And this is as critical it is for the nominations committee or the appointing group, let's say, as it is for candidates themselves. It's a special role. And this stuff that I'm going to share is beyond what the normal duties of a director or governor would be. And that's critical to say that. They have the same duties and roles and responsibilities as every other governor. So this is the stuff that goes above and beyond that. And that's why the role of a chair, usually if it's a paid position, is paid more because there's more time, more responsibility involved in this sort of stuff. It's a high level leadership role, even though they're equal partners. So there's 5 key areas in which the key duties of a chair beyond the normal stuff. And one is strategic leadership. And what I mean by that is they are leading the board around the strategy, the direction of the board itself, as well as working hand in hand with management around that sort of strategy of the organization. But this is really about their leadership of the group itself and what they need to do to lead that group, who they need to do to lead that group. Next up is the chair will also be the lead in terms of standards. In the same way you look to our leaders to display the most professional and personal standards, and they inspire or not inspire us, depending on who you're looking towards, the chair also upholds the most professional and personal standards. And essentially, they lead by example would be a great way to do that. They also uphold procedural matters. So again, they're in charge of the meeting. They work with various people to put the agenda together. And their role is to make sure that all procedures are followed, or that their job is to ensure that the people who understand the procedures, potentially the company secretary or whoever the governance expert is, they're making sure that they're checking. Do we need to just check our procedural stuff here? So again, it comes down to standards, but it's making sure that processes are followed and make sure the board is doing what they're supposed to do. Obviously, the chair, as the leader, has to be very good and very keen at building relationships, not just with the fellow governors, but also with key stakeholders. And here the most key relationship is with the head of school or the principal. They work hand in hand. Those two are the conduits through to the rest of the school by the board and management and through to everybody else. And so, building relationships, understanding people, learning about people is absolutely critical duty of the board. And a lot of these things are similar to all governors, but this is extra especially important. Plus also the chair should be driving the training of the board and the evaluation of the board. It's part of their job to ensure that the board is as effective and successful as possible. And that means training and evaluating and checking, doing health checks. We've mentioned health checks in a previous webinar as well. So these are sort of like a summary of the critical parts of the role. The next few slides are this broken down into several bullet points. And you'll see I'm flicking through them there. I'm not going to go through these line by line. What I would suggest, if you're reading this or watching this, is to pause the recording and note these down, or you can go to our LinkedIn group and download the slides or request the slides, or they will be available on the PD Academia website as well. So there's some very critical ones in there, and it's really going to be up to the board or the committee to decide what are the most important parts of these that we want. But moving forward then, whilst we've got you to understand what are the role and responsibilities of the chair, we also want to make sure we have the right person, not just doing the right job, but the right person as well. So these are really about the qualities of the effective chair. And again, I draw your attention back to starting with your values, your mission, your vision for the school as well. And one of the key things here to remember is that that long list of stuff that could be really scary. You know, oops, sorry. It can be really scary. And I want to pause and tell a story. One of my mentees has been asked to step up from deputy chair to chair. And she's seen this information before, but I've shared it with her. And it scared her that she didn't feel ready. And I think the key thing here is that the role of the chair is not for everyone. And I'll go through a little bit about what I mean by that when I talk about the mistakes that might make. It's not for everyone. Not everyone is built to be a chairperson, a chair of the board. However, it's also something you can grow into. And this is what I told my mentee as well. You know, you may not have everything, you may not have done this, but then you need to surround yourself with people and also work towards it. But if you're the sort of person that has the attitude and the qualities of an effective chair, you can grow into the role and responsibility. So it's more important that you have the ability to become a great chair rather than you really, really understand all the role and responsibilities up front, which is what I'm trying to get to. So it's a scary list, and for a nominations committee, you really want to be understanding what are the priorities in terms of who do we need this chair to be. Then moving through to the qualities. The way I want to pitch this is more about, you know, if you were putting yourself forward to be the chair, who do you need to be? At the same time as thinking about it to the nominations committee in terms of who we need to find. So for me, there's just realised with 5 key mistakes we want to get through before we move on to that. So we'll just do the mistakes quickly first. The first mistake, and I think is relevant to those who talk about this, in terms of not everybody is built to be a chair. And one of the mistakes that boards make is they default to the most senior person. And that could be age, experience, time on the board. And that can be a very wrong decision to make because they may not be built in terms of they may not have the qualities of a chair. They may just be defined by their seniority. The next mistake is, as I've said to my mentee, expecting the chair to know everything. It's a huge responsibility, but you also need to allow that person to grow into the role, especially if they haven't done it before. It doesn't mean they're not going to make a great chair. You just have to give them time and obviously give them options in terms of they don't know everything. The third thing is thinking that the board is a hierarchy, and I mentioned this beforehand. Politically, it can feel like a hierarchy in terms of, but legally, unless it's written down in the Articles of Association, every governor is the same. Usually a board chair won't have a veto right in terms of they can't go against the will of the board. They may have a casting vote if it's a split vote, if you have like an equal number of governors, but essentially the board is not really a hierarchy, but they do play a leadership role. The fourth mistake is settling. The fourth mistake the board would make was settling for the person who puts their hand up and no one else puts their hand up. You really have to make sure that the chair is the right person. If only one person's putting their hand up and you believe they're not right, then you've got to think about, do we need to bring on somebody else, or do we have to have another different conversation about who is chair and why? And then finally, I've mentioned this a few times, it's really critical that you have clear procedures for appointing, evaluating, and removing the chair. You know, a lot of people believe that it's impossible to remove a chair from these sort of organizations because they have all the power. If it's not written down, it could be really hard. So how can you, if you've got a bad appointment as chair, how can you as a board remove the chair? So it's really important that the whole process is written down. So those are the key mistakes that you don't want to make when appointing the chair of your board. And I want to just carry on with what I said beforehand in terms of these are the top tips when you're thinking about who should be your chair in terms of the qualities, but also if you are thinking about becoming a chair, these are things for you to think about. And there's 3 categories here, and they're all centered around respect. So respect the position. So you got to remember, why do we have board meetings in the first place? Why are we getting together? What are we trying to achieve? And you want to be that leader that people want to follow. So next is respect the process. You're there to create the agenda in collaboration. You want people to stay aligned, keep on track, respect the time because you have limited time together. And when and if it's needed, call for a vote. So again, really be keen eye on the processes and protocols of the role of the board. And if they don't have them, let's start writing them in. And finally, respect the people. Being a chair, being a really effective chair is very much about your role of getting the best out of the group of people. It's like any leadership position. Your job is to help everybody else do their job really well. And that's what leadership is. So you need to understand the people around you, get to know them, listen to them. So really understand, communicate with them as well, and keep your commitments to people. And these people are not just your fellow governors, but also key stakeholders like the head of school, other management positions, your members, your community, the regulators, all these different stakeholders that we've actually gone through in the evaluation health check webinar. We talked about all the different stakeholders. Your role as a chair is to respect these people. You know, if I was thinking about some of the values you'd want the chair to display, then we can always go back to Nolan's principles that we've mentioned over and over again, which is like selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. We've talked about these values of ways of putting the board together, of what individuals and the group, the qualities and attributes of the individual and the group, and they're no different for a chair. And these are all the sort of things that you would combine up. And if you were putting together a role description or a job description or an advertisement for a position of chair, whether internally or recruiting from a group of existing governors, or you were trying to bring in externally, you would bring in all of these aspects: the role and the responsibilities, the qualities that you'd want, and the attributes and the values that you want them to display. Because they'll act as a filter, but also you're managing expectations, and then this is what you're recruiting for. So that's
Hey, Paul.
a quick one. Yes, please, Michael.
So, you know, when we reflect on the top 10 tips for the board chairs and the principles that we'd want them to lead and guide the board by, you know, what does that look like when a board chair feels they need to act against the will of the board? You know, some examples might be around decision making, where the board, the other governors, or even the chair in this particular case, are looking to make a decision that's in the best interest of the school in the short term, just because they want to move on. They need to move past some type of controversy or conflict that's happened. And so they're using this as just an opportunity to make some decisions around some quick change, to get a quick win so they can move on, and then with the intention of wanting to address it later. How would you consult a chair in this particular case that has this dilemma? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to make sure everybody walks out of that boardroom lockstep.
Yeah, so this comes, assuming that the chair doesn't have a veto, and even if you did have a veto on something, it's something you wouldn't want to really use because it's going to create divisions within the board. So it comes down to influence. And, you know, we all know there's plenty of ways to create influence with people. So you need to first understand, why have I got a minority view compared to the rest of the board? What is it that they don't know that I know that might convince them otherwise? But even if you share the information, it might not sway them. So, and it happens all the time. And we've done this in workshops before, Michael, with some schools around different processes to create buy-in of ownership or ownership of decision without consensus. One of the biggest things you see in the boardroom is you don't get consensus all the time on every single decision. So, and without a well-run board and a great culture, you create divisions and then people wanting to undermine. And that's the worst thing. You can undermine decision externally. That's the worst thing you want to happen. So there's lots of different processes and techniques, and we've gone through one in the past called deep democracy, which essentially is designed not to create consensus, not about finding some middle ground, but it's about creating buy-in and ownership of a decision, even if you don't disagree with it, because you've been heard. And I think that's what it's all about. So for these chairs that are going through this process, you know, why have you got the minority view? How can you influence people? What do you do if you don't influence them? And I don't think undermining them would not be the way to go, but you can continue the conversation after a decision has to be made, if it's time specific. But also, what processes can you bring in place onto a board when you do have some really difficult decisions to make, which can split the board? What processes can you bring in place to help create that ownership, even if we don't have consensus? That answer your question? I'm assuming yes. So we're coming to the end of our webinar now. So pretty much what we've gone through is, why do we have a chair? Like, you know, they're the most important, but how do we appoint the chair? And there's lots of different ways in which chairs are appointed. It's usual practice and best practice to have a nominations committee, and then you're either seeking nominations or you're appointing from within an existing group, or you're bringing in a third party as a chair to the board for the first time, but you'll still use a nominations committee if you have that. Whether it's voted on by third parties like members of your school, it comes down to your Articles of Association. What is the role of the chair? Well, the role of the chair is no different to the role of all of the governors, but they have extra special duties, and it's all about leadership and it's all about people, and it's all about following procedures. Who should and shouldn't be the chair? Again, some of them stakes and what are the qualities of a good chair? First things to avoid is making sure you don't appoint the wrong person by just assuming that they should be the most senior person, the most knowledgeable person, the one with the most experience of that school. That's not a good place to start. You want the one who can get the most out of the group of people around them and will build the most effective and successful relationships with all the key people. They're a leader that people want to follow, and they're the one that respects the role, the position, the process, and the people the most. And we really discussed about why the chair is important. Again, I talk to this a lot when we're helping people to onto their first board roles, how a chair, the wrong chair, can actually break your career. But you want someone who inspires you, who you can work with. So when you're actually joining a board, the chair is so important. On the board, the chair is really, really important. They are that board leader, and it's an absolutely vital role. And I would just encourage every school, any board listening to this, to think really carefully about how you go about appointing them and who you are appointing. So that's the end of this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Basically, as we mentioned up front, we have a LinkedIn group. We have the YouTube when this will be appearing. You can find all of this material on the PD Academia website, and we look forward to hosting another webinar in the near future on some other topics which are impacting the way in which schools are governed, and hopefully bring you some best practice tips and hints. Thank you very much indeed.